So good afternoon. We're here to talk about value chain stewardship. And increasingly, as we're seeing companies shift their focus away from just looking at scope 1 and 2 emissions, also taking into consideration scope 3 emissions, what does that mean for accountability and responsibility throughout an entire supply chain? I'm joined here today by...
Hi, I'm Jason Smith, so I'm a partner in PA's Climate Response Group, and I'm responsible for value chain.
And I'm John Knight. I'm a partner in PA's Climate Response Group, and I do industrial decarbonisation and net zero pathways.
That's brilliant. Thanks, gents. So, Jason, where would you say, let's start with the basics. What's the difference between supply chain and value chain stewardship?
Yeah, no, it's interesting, John Cool, because in the past, I think people have spoken about them very much in the same vein, but value chain is really, the flow of value chain actually flows from the customer. So it's extending those customer requirements to look at the design, innovation, and really get into the product. So how do they articulate that value through the product? Whereas supply chain is very much product driven. So driven from the supply base, how do you get those raw materials manufactured, made to a product, and then shipped to the end customer? So the value chain is much more around the value that the customer perceives they get from the product and driving that customer value.
So really, what you're saying is that it's more about the entire value chain narrative versus just the product that companies and people used to originally buy.
Absolutely. I think the one thing we are seeing at the moment is consumers are starting to be much more thoughtful around the products that they buy, around the organisations who they buy them from. A great example of that is Unilever, who, through their partnerships program, they really work with communities in some of the countries that they work in, making sure that they can improve living standards, making sure that they're ethical around how they, feed back into that community, how they translate those things to make people, genuinely feel good about themselves, around the dignity, around the respect, and giving things back into the community. And what we're seeing at the moment is consumers are really starting to, appreciate that, understand that, and start to value that in the products that they buy.
So essentially, they're paying for the S of ESG, that social value, as part of the product and the narrative they're buying. John, in terms of, what are you seeing? Maybe taking the angle of decarbonisation, scope 3 emissions, what are you seeing as some of the challenges?
Yeah, to Jason's point, that real point around the value chain is getting driven across not just the consumer products, but also across larger heavy industry as well. So when you start to look at, for example, electric vehicles, everyone thinks they're great, but at the end of the day, they're still made of steel, and steel is one of the largest carbon contributors and steel manufacturers to overall greenhouse gases. So it's how do you actually decarbonise the steel supply side, whether that's through hydrogen or carbon capture. But when you do that, you make additional products. So not only do you add the value to the value chain by changing the raw material base and decarbonising, you're creating a secondary market, say through production of carbon dioxide or additional waste materials, which can then be turned into other products, which kind of creates a separate new source. And we have this, waste to X movement around building circular business models using waste products to derive power, new products, which goes beyond just traditional recycling.
I think what's really interesting is this kind of merging of traditional non-compete industries, because based upon resource scarcity, companies are starting to work together in unlikely partnerships, as you were referencing earlier. I think that's something that's interesting. Where are you seeing some good examples of that?
It's interesting, just coming in the room today and picking up one of the coffee capsules. One great example of that is Nespresso, who sought to look at making their products more circular, more sustainable. And one of the unlikely partnerships that they formed was with Victorinox, who actually manufacture Swiss Army knives. So both companies in Switzerland, from a supply chain perspective, very similar. Actually, they designed and manufactured a complete Swiss Army knife from the recycled coffee pods, from the aluminium coffee pods. And we're seeing them extend that. So that has also gone into other products such as pens, bicycles, even artwork. And even the coffee that's in those capsules is being used as a fertiliser for soil, and also a product in biogas. So, real innovative discussions that are across industry.
That's very fascinating. Just talking about that kind of waste to X movement, I don't know if you're seeing any other opportunities around that.
Yeah, so I mean, we're doing some work at the moment where we're looking at the production of synthetic air fuels, which actually prevents the production of further fossil fuels through, oil and gas, and takes carbon dioxide and hydrogen and forms a synthetic fuel. So we're using those waste products and using green electricity to make hydrogen, to then make a synthetic fuel, and looking at how that actually changes the entire value chain around fuel production and moves it away from an oil and gas focus.
Just final thoughts that I have around this. I think what we're seeing, especially looking at net zero strategies, maybe that's the catalyst, is that Scope 3 and value chains needs to be part of a core strategy of any given company. And it doesn't mean you have to take absolute responsibility for every single action. It's really focusing on what you're good at and then partnering for everything else. I think that would be one of my key takeaways in this particular area. John, I don't know what you think.
Yeah, and I think just building on that aspect of looking at the value chain is reassessing then how your supply chain works to fulfill that value chain. Raw materials that we use today are not going to be the raw materials we use tomorrow. And so really taking that attitude of really reassessing the supply chain to make sure it matches the values is going to be quite important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just to add to that, I think just respecting people is good for business, and having that stewardship, that knowledge of your value chain, and understanding how you're improving the community, how you're improving the planet. I think that consumers are more and more looking for businesses that can help them with the thinking around that. So I think that's going to become increasingly important.
That's brilliant. So just really taking all of that ethics and environment, so planet and human, together into one consideration is key. It's also de-risking supply chains, I think, in general.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.